Welcome back to Class with Cole at CWM University, and today we're going to do part 2 of converting fractions to decimals to percents. Would you rather have 3/4 of a pizza, 75/100 of a pizza, or 75% of a pizza? I hope you say that they're all the same thing. Today I'm going to show you how to teach your students how to easily convert between fractions, decimals to percent, so that they know that 3/4, 75/100, and 75% are all equivalent. Let's go over the vocabulary that you would need to go over with your students to make sure that they understand these terms before starting your lesson. You have numerator, denominator, fraction, decimal, percent, simplify, divisor, dividend, quotient, equivalent, and greatest common factor. These are the vocabulary words you will hear me say throughout the lesson, and to make sure that you're reinforcing these words with the students so when they hear them or when they read them, they know exactly what they are. Today, we're going to focus on benchmark fractions. It makes math 100 times easier if the students can memorize just the first benchmark fraction of each one. So 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5, 1/8. They just know those with their equivalent decimal and their equivalent percent. Most of these that they will see in 6th grade, it'll be easy for them to figure out. They don't have to memorize them, but if they can, it's going to make it a lot easier. If I need to figure out the decimal for 3/8, if I know that 1/8 is equivalent to 0.125, I could either add 0.125 3 times, or I can take 0.125 and times it by 3 and get the answer. Either way, I can easily find out what the decimal is for 3/8 without dividing it and trying to go through that whole process. I would just know. I can just use my mental math because I know the decimal for 1/8. Before converting fractions to decimals, we need to pull up in the parking lot for simplifying fractions. When you take a park here, go over simplifying fractions because this is a skill the students will need to know prior to this lesson. This is something that you should go over before you start this lesson. You should have gone over it already, but if you haven't, they need to know these skills to make converting fractions easier for them. Now, when I first started teaching, I was taught to teach my students to simplify fractions. The first thing I need to teach them is to find the greatest common factor. But I realized my students struggled with finding the greatest common factor. If they didn't have a multiplication chart sitting right in front of them, they struggled, and it took them a long time just to try to figure out what's the greatest common factor that I could divide by. So I gave them 3 steps to try. First, to simplify a fraction. Try these 3 things, and if you cannot simplify a fraction with this, then we'll move on to greatest common factor. But a lot of the times, these 3 rules or these 3 tries, they work for the students, and we didn't have to get to greatest common factor. Step 1, the students need to know if the numerator and the denominator, they need to ask themselves, are they both even? If they are even, I can divide by 2. Now, dividing by 2 is the same thing as finding halves. So I did do a mini lesson on finding halves. Some students, mentally, they can do it quick. But for my students who didn't have that, I had to teach them how to find halves. So let's look at the numbers 54, 82, and 25. And I'm going to show you what I showed my students in order to find halves of numbers. So we're going to find half of 54. I'm going to write the expanded form of 54. So that's 50 plus 4. And then I'm going to find the halves of those numbers. So half of 50, if I know my money, half of 50 cents is 25. And then half of 4 is 2. Then I can add 25 plus 2, which is 27. So half of 54 is 27. Then I'm going to write the expanded form of 82. I'm going to use 80 plus 2. And then I'm going to find the half of 80. Half of 80 is 40. And then half of 2 is 1. So 40 plus 1 is 41. So half of 82 is 41. Now for 25, I'm going to break it down in 3 numbers. I'm going to write down 20. Then I'm going to add 4. And then I'm going to add 1 because it's not as easy to break down half of 5. So half of 20 is 10. Half of 4 is 2. And then half of $1 is 50 cents. And then when I add all these together, 10 plus 2 is 12. And then add the 50 cents, that's 12.5. Now, we're going to take this fraction, 8 divided by 32, and we're going to find half of the numerator, which is 4, and then half of that denominator. I'm going to break that down into 20, 10, and 2. Some students will know the half of 30, but some will not. So they may use 20 plus 10 and give you 30. So half of 20 is 10. Half of 10 is 5. And then half of 2 is 1. So if you add all that together, I'm going to get 16. So my new fraction will be 4 over 16. Now, yes, I can divide the numerator and denominator by 4, but right now we're focusing on finding halves. So half of 4 is 2, half of 16 is 8. And I'm going to do that one more time. Half of 2 is 1, and half of 8 is 4. So the students can sit there and use long division divided by 2, or you can just show them how to find half of a number. If my numerator and my denominator is not even, let me see if they end in the numbers end in a 0 and a 5. If the numerator and the denominator ends in either 0 or 5, I could try to divide by 5. So 85 ends in a 5 and 100 ends in a 0. So we're going to divide the numerator and the denominator by 5. And I need to see how many 5s are in 100, which I know is 20. And then the students can count by 5 until they get to 85. So how many 5s are in 85? That is 17. Now I have my simplified fraction, 17/20. If they're both not even, if they both don't end in a 0 and 5, I need to then ask myself for step 3, can the numerator divide into the denominator? So I tell my students, can I count by the numerator to get to the denominator? So I'm going to ask myself, can I count by 25 to get to 50? Yes. So I'm going to divide the numerator and the denominator by 25. How many 25s are in 25? 1. And how many 25s are in 50? 2. So my simplified fraction is a half. Now, can I count by 4s to get to 32? Yes. So I'm going to divide the numerator and the denominator by 4. How many 4s are in 4? 1. And how many 4s are in 32? 8. So my simplified fraction is 1/8. And then, of course, if these 3 steps do not work, the students can work on trying to find a greatest common factor between the 2 numbers. Now that we have went over how to simplify fractions, we're going to talk about how to go from fraction to decimal, from decimal to percent, from fraction to percent. Most of the fractions that we're going to use are already simplified, but the students need to know how to simplify fractions just in case they get fractions that are not simplified. Now we're going to go over finding equivalent fractions. Equivalent fractions are different fractions that represent the same value. You can find an equivalent fraction that will help you go from fraction to percent by either using 10 or 100 as the denominator. For this particular lesson, we're going to keep the denominator 100 to reinforce for the students that percents are out of 100. But of course, some of your students are going to realize that I could use 10 and get to the answer faster. I can find an equivalent fraction with the denominator of 10 to get my answers faster. But for this particular example, we're going to use 100 for both of our denominators. So we can keep reinforcing to the students that to go from a fraction to a percent, percents are out of 100. So we're going to take our fraction 3/4 and we're going to set it equal to a denominator of 100. So I need to figure out how can I get from 4 to 100. And what if I do to the denominator, I have to do to the numerator. So there's 25 4s in 100. So if I multiply by 25 at the bottom, I have to multiply by 25 at the top. And 3 times 25 is 75. So I know percents are out of 100, so 75 out of 100 is 75%. And then I'm going to have the students fill in the hundreds grid to make that connection. That if I fill in 75 of these, it's going to represent 75%, which is also equivalent to 3/4. I'm going to do the same thing with 1/5. I'm going to set equivalent to 100, and I have to figure out how many 5s are in 100. And I tell the students all the time, what I do to the bottom of the fraction, I must do to the top. And I say it enough so then they start saying it. And then that's 1 times 20 is 20. So 20 out of 100 is 20%. And then I'm going to fill in that hundreds grid to reinforce that. And then I also know that 20% is 1/5. Next, we're going to go from a fraction to a decimal. Of course, the students will need to know the parts of a fraction. What does the numerator represent? What does the denominator represent? And then they need to know that the numerator is the dividend and the denominator is the divisor. So now we're going to divide this fraction to get from fraction to decimal. So we're going to take the fraction and turn it on its right side. And the students can just turn their paper to the right just so they'll know what number to put where. We know that 8 is our divisor and 3 is going to be our dividend. And then we're going to use long division to divide it. So I'm going to quickly go through the steps of long division and find out what the decimal is that's equivalent to 3/8. So now I see that 3/8 is equivalent to 375 thousandths just by using long division to figure it out. So we're going to do the same thing with the fraction 2/3. We're going to turn on this right side and then go ahead and write it out in the division problem. 3 is our divisor, 2 is our dividend. And then we're going to go ahead and divide that. Now, when dividing 2/3, the students are going to start to notice a pattern that is still doing the same thing. 20 minus 18, 20 minus 18. That means we have a repeating decimal. And so 2/3 is equivalent to 66 hundredths. And we're going to put a line over the 6 for repeating. Then finally, we're going to go from fraction to decimal to percent. For this example, the students are just going to read the fraction out loud. So, of course, the students will need to know how to read fractions. They should come to you by now knowing how to read fractions. But just in case they don't, go over these examples with them. We're going to read the fraction out loud. And whatever we read, we're going to use the place value chart and write out our decimal. And then we're going to take our decimal and change it to a percent. So the student will read the fraction out loud, 1/10. And I'm going to use the place value chart to know where tenths end, one place behind the decimal. And then I'm going to write it out. I'm going to put 1 in the tenths place, a 0 in the ones. And then I can take this decimal and change it to a percent. And I can move the decimal 2 times to the right, add my placeholder. That gives me 10%. Or the students could take 1/10 and times it by 10. So now 15 hundredths, I know I need to go 2 places behind the decimal. I'm going to write in the 15. And then I need to take these 15 hundredths is now a decimal and change it to a percent. Take the decimal, move it 2 times to the right, and I'm going to have 15%. Doing from fraction to decimal to percent. So let's review. To simplify fractions, try those 3 rules first, and then have the student find the greatest common factor if they do not work. To go from fraction to decimal, turn that fraction on its right side and divide. The students need to know the part of the fraction. Make sure you put the dividend where it belongs and put the divisor where it belongs. And then to go from a decimal to a percent, the student can multiply the decimal by 100 or move that decimal 2 times to the right. Equivalent fraction decimals and percents are just different languages saying the same thing. If you didn't get a chance to catch the fraction decimals and percents part 1, here's the video right here. Go ahead and check that out. Let me know if this video has been helpful. What are some other things that you use with your students to help them convert fractions, decimals, and percents? Comment below and let me know. Please share this with a teacher that you think it may help. If you haven't yet, like this video and subscribe to my channel. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch this video. And you already know. Until next time.